Good morning, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us today for EnergySource Innovation Stream, where we highlight new energy technologies with the potential to reshape the global energy system. Today, we will be hearing from Will Gardiner, Chief Executive Officer of the Drax Group, who will discuss adding carbon capture and storage to biomass generation at the UK's largest power station. Before we get started, we will do a quick poll, and while you're doing that, I'll go over two administrative details. So Roger, why don't we get started with the poll? Today, we'd like to get your thoughts on what global biofuels demand will be in 2040. For reference, in 2019, it was 2.1 MBD, 2019, 2.1 MBD. We're looking at 3 million for 2040, 4 million, 5 million, or 6 million. So please make your choice. You'll have 30 seconds to answer, and we'll go over our administrative details. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag InnovationStream. Second, after Will's presentation, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will try to get to as many of these as we can. If you're watching on another platform like YouTube or Twitter, unfortunately, we can't take your questions. Okay, time to wrap up the poll. Thank you to all who participated. Now back to the program. We'll get to the results after Will's presentation. But first, please let me welcome Will to the Atlantic Council. Will, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you, Randy. Great to be here. From a lockdown London, it's probably a little quieter here than it is over there, given all the things that are going on. But thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to be here. How is coronavirus and lockdown and the changing policies of lockdown in the UK impacting your work?
So for me, personally, I'm at home, and I've been largely at home for most of the year, to be honest. At this point, I've actually, unfortunately, had the virus and got through that in March. From a business perspective, I mean, we are, as a power company, we are keeping, doing everything we can to keep running, and we're doing that well. And it's not necessarily that easy because we have a supply chain bringing pellets over, a lot of them from the U.S. So we got to keep that supply chain moving. And then for a lot of our folks who collect, who actually bill, collect, serve customers, they're all working from home now. So we went sort of pretty rapidly to a virtual call center type environment.
Well, I'm sorry to hear you had the virus. Looks like you're fully recovered.
Yeah.
So no lingering issues or anything?
No, it's been fine. Thank you.
Great to hear. Great to hear. Well, why don't we go to your presentation? I'm really looking forward to seeing this, and then we'll come back to Q&A. And I know I'm going to have a bunch of questions, so come back to Q&A in a little bit.
Great. So I am going to do my best to share my screen here, guys. So hopefully that's, can you see that pretty well, Randy?
Yep, that looks great.
Great. So why don't I will start right in. And what I thought I'd do, maybe I'll just give you a bit of an introduction to Drax. So Drax is a power company based in the UK, publicly traded. We have a market cap around £1.2 billion. Started life as a coal-fired power station in Yorkshire. We generate about 5% of the UK's power and have done for a long time. And over the course of the last sort of 10, 15 years, we've been on a journey to convert the power station from what was all coal to what is now pretty much all biomass. We've already announced that we would expect to stop running coal at the end of March of next year. So about 4-5 more months there. So at the company, we have a very clear purpose, which is to enable a zero carbon, lower cost energy future. And we aim to do that in 3 ways: by building a long-term future for sustainable biomass, to be a provider of system stability, or the leading provider of power system stability in the UK, and also to give customers greater control of their energy. And about a year ago, at COP25 in Madrid, we announced our ambition, which is to be a carbon negative company by 2030, which is what I'll spend most of my time now talking about, and how we'll use BECCS to do that. Again, so just a little bit of a highlight of our journey we've been on. We were back at the beginning of the last decade. We would have been emitting about 23 million tons of CO2 per year as a coal-fired power station. We're down sort of well under 5 last year. And fundamentally, if we add carbon capture and storage to our biomass generation, we could deliver as much as 16 million tons of what we like to call negative emissions. And you can see on the right-hand side of that slide, we think we've actually reduced our CO2 intensity pretty much as anybody. And fundamentally, that's been about this transformation of the business from coal to biomass. And maybe I'll talk first a little bit about that, because I think from a sort of innovation perspective, it's sort of an interesting story, because there aren't many power stations that have gone to the sort of whole hog 100% conversion from coal to biomass. And I guess I'd sort of highlight 3 pieces of that. The first and sort of biggest piece of that sort of physically was actually building the sort of materials handling piece of it, and actually being able to safely manage the biomass. And we use wood pellets sourced about 60% from the US, 20% from Canada, 20% from the rest of the world. For those of you not so familiar with biomass, biomass dust is highly combustible, so it has to be managed very carefully. So the actual physical supply chain, which you can see parts of there, the conveyors and then those domes, biomass again has to be kept dry all the time. So that's quite a significant sort of logistics challenge to manage that supply chain. If you move up into the the generators, the boilers, the actual sort of electricity generation piece of it, once you've got the pellets into the mills, and basically Drax is a pulverized fuel boiler. So from the mills onward, the process fundamentally doesn't change, right? So just in the same way you take the coal, crush it, turn it into dust, same with the wood pellets. And so from that point on, effectively the challenge is actually not so different from coal. But what many people sort of wondered whether it was possible was, could you get the same thermal efficiency using biomass as you could get from coal? And we have done that, greater than 39%. And also, could you get the same throughput? So we have 4 biomass power generating units at Drax, each one of them capable of generating 645 megawatts of power. And we actually are getting as much, if not maybe a little bit more, from biomass as we were getting from coal. And one of the big challenges also around this is actually managing the boilers over time. And we've done a lot of things, or interesting things around managing slagging, fouling, the types of things that make biomass or coal or biomass boilers sort of degrade over time. And actually there's some interesting stuff there that I'm happy to talk further on in questions, right? But fundamentally, we now have a biomass power station with 4 645 megawatt units that are generating as much power as they would have been under coal. If you think about the next step in this journey, it's really about adding carbon capture and storage. And the first point I wanted to make is that the case or the need for negative emissions, we think, is becoming stronger and stronger all the time. And so what you see here is the Climate Change Committee in the UK. And again, the Climate Change Committee was formed in the UK about 12 years ago as part of the Climate Change Act. And their role is to provide advice to the UK government as to what strategies are available for decarbonizing and now for hitting net zero in 2050, which is a legally binding target that the UK has committed to. And in their latest scenario, they see on the left-hand side, there's probably about 90 million tons of residual CO2 emissions under their base case scenario in 2050. And they think that there'll be a need for at least 50 million tons of negative emissions to offset that. And they talk about that coming specifically from BECCS. And you can see there that our 4 units could do 16 million of that 50 million tons in negative emissions. Again, the same is true on a global scale, and I won't spend much time on this, but the IPCC scenarios call for using significant amounts of negative emissions, and specifically BECCS. And also you can see on the right-hand side, there's a strong case for that also in the US. So what are we actually sort of doing at the power station? So effectively, the idea we will add sort of an absorber column onto at the back end of the power station. So everything else stays the same. You pass the flue gas through that absorber, mixes with a solvent. Effectively, that solvent is then CO2 rich. You put it back through heat exchange and you take the CO2 out, and that CO2 then will go into a pipeline. So, and that pipeline would then go from Drax, which is about 60 kilometers off the coast, inland off the coast of the North Sea. And then the idea is that it'll take an offshore and stored under the North Sea in effectively a saline aquifer. So where is everything happening in the UK? We're working on a bunch of different fronts to make this happen. We've developed a coalition for negative emissions to actually make the case for this. We've also enabled a group of companies in the Humber region working together as an industrial cluster to work on putting together the infrastructure for this. The UK government has committed about £800 million sort of as a first step in enabling carbon capture and storage infrastructure in the UK. So if I think about the overall program, there's probably four pieces that need to come into play. So one is the infrastructure, and the government is sort of well underway at actually enabling that to happen. So the current state of that, for example, is that we are the Zero Carbon Humber industrial cluster that we are part of, put together a proposal to actually get government funding for the next step of that, and we should learn more about that in December. And if all goes according to plan, the pipeline would start potentially building that pipeline and offshore infrastructure in 2024. Second thing that happens is our own technology development. We're in the process of trialing a couple of different solvents to enable the carbon capture. And we would expect to be through a pre-feed process there in probably the middle of next year, moving into a feed study. So again, we would expect to be ready to make a final investment decision to start actually developing the project again somewhere in the early to mid 2024 timeframe, in line with that pipeline. And then the UK government, aligned with industry and a bunch of different players in CCS, is working on what is the right regulatory model to enable this to happen. Right? And so there's a lot of active work going on there. We would expect over, again, probably the course of the next 2 or 3 years that will be firmed up. And again, in line with that objective of getting everything ready to go in 2024. Right? So again, short summary, we think that BECCS and other negative emissions technologies are going to be key to the whole idea of reducing emissions and delivering net zero. BECCS is a great way to do that and is ready and proven and ready to go. And we think it's a very attractive value for money solution, which again, I can talk more about if that comes up in questions. So Randy, I'm going to stop sharing and stop presenting there and be ready to take any questions that people might have.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Will. That was really great. Let's first go to the poll because I think the results are interesting, and we will see that the winner is 6 million. So we have a crowd who thinks there's going to be a lot of demand for biofuels by 2040. And so obviously you are part of that story. And looking at the multiple solutions we're going to need to reach net zero, negative emissions technology and power of the sort you are working on seems to be part of the solution. We're starting to get a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so everybody, they're popping up faster than I can even read them. That's great. One question I just want to ask from just to sort of set the table is the question about the sustainability of biomass, and how there are concerns with that, and how do you overcome those concerns and ensure that the biomass that you are purchasing, that Drax is purchasing, is sustainable?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Randy, and I think it's something that we think about, we worry about all the time, because if it's not sustainable and it's not actually delivering sort of positive carbon outcomes, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So the first point I would start with is that the sort of regulatory framework that we have in the UK has very strict requirements in what we need to do. So we need to be able to say where all of our wood pellets come from. We need to be able to say that they come from forests that are being managed properly. They're coming from forests that are growing. And then we also have a further sort of policy ourselves. We need to make we are committed to not damaging biodiversity, for example. And the fundamental point for me is that if we're getting our wood either as a residue, so fundamentally, for example, we get about almost half of what we use is coming from sawmill residues. Right? So fundamentally, something that really is not impacting the forest directly at all anyway. And the second thing is we have to, those things that are coming from the forest need to be coming from forests that are growing, right? Where we're actually clear that actually there's more CO2 in the following year than there was before that's actually stored in that forest, right? And just by way of example, the forest cover, the carbon stock in the southeast of the US, which is where we get a lot of our fiber from, is about 50% bigger now than it was, say, back in the 1960s. Right?
Hmm.
So again, it's a combination of making sure that you're having positive forest outcomes and that actually you can verify those, right? So the verification is
Yeah.
also a key part of this, right?
So do you actually have people who are working on that verification process? Do you have people sort of checking this regularly and
Yeah,
working with the
absolutely.
forest management?
So I mean, just if I, for us personally, specifically, we have our foresters who actually work with, our sort of suppliers to actually understand what fiber we're getting. We have a different team of what we call sustainability foresters. We're actually verifying that everything's done the right way. We're a member of every pellet that we use has to be actually certified by something called the Sustainable Biomass Program, which is actually a certification body that ensures that this is done right. And as I said before, we have to submit, regulatory filings with Ofgem here in the UK every year that effectively says this is where every one of those pellets come from, and they meet their very strict sustainability criteria.
Got it. Do you see a sort of maximum where at which it's sort of impossible to have enough biomass to be sustainable? Is there a theoretical limit to how much
Yeah,
biomass
yeah.
can be part of the energy
It's
system
a very,
industrially?
again, very good question. So we, as we've been sort of ramping up the idea and getting more excited about BECCS, we've been doing a lot of work on that question among others. I mean, for example, the whole value for money question, that's another one that's quite critical to the whole story. But so we did some work last year with McKinsey, and we looked at the question, on a global basis, how much biomass did we think there would be? And we applied, sustainability filters that are sort of actually a bit more stringent than the ones that are applied to us today. So you sort of start with the sort of the full forest. You only are able to use part of the growth in 1 year. Then you only use residuals. You exclude big parts of areas where there's risk of loss of biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. And you have a whole set of filters, and you end up using something less than 1% of the fiber that's available. And with that fiber, we think there's enough biomass that you could actually deliver about 4 gigatons of BECCS, of effectively
Mhm.
negative emissions, right? And just to give you a sense, that's about the amount of emissions you get in today's world from the aviation industry. So there is a limit, and it has to be managed carefully, but fundamentally, it can make a significant difference.
That's really fascinating. I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. I actually that the question. My first question was asked by a number of folks, including our friend Philippe Vidren, who almost used the exact same language I used. And Philippe, just so you know, I hadn't read your question, but when I asked mine, I want to go to a question from Daniel Berg, who asked if you considered the production and transportation chain as part of your emissions impact. So have you thought about the shipping, all those
Yeah.
pieces that get your pellets to the Drax facility?
No, so we do, and I mean, just to give you some of the math. I mean, if effectively, very roughly speaking, if you deliver 1 megawatt hour of power, there's about sort of 900 kilograms of CO2 associated with that. Again, the idea is that that's recaptured in the forest, so that's what makes it neutral. In order to get that fiber from the forest through the pellet plants into the power station in the UK, it's about 140 kilograms of CO2 involved in that process, right? So that is real, and we acknowledge that. Something we're working on. I mean, we're working on looking at ways we can reduce the carbon footprint of shipping, for example, through wind-based technologies. And there's all sorts of stuff we're doing there. And one of the other things I think is um, ultimately important about BECCS or interesting about BECCS longer term is if you think about the cost sort of profile of BECCS, there's fundamentally the logistics costs and the pelletizing costs are a big part of it, right? In line, frankly, with that carbon footprint, right? So if you actually were to sort of start now, and we are working on this, and say, well, we're not going to sort of necessarily just do this at Drax, but we'll do this somewhere where frankly, you can optimize for some of those logistics costs, right? You think about a place like Louisiana, southeast of the U.S. You put a power station next to a sawmill or in the middle of a bunch of them. You bring in the sawmill residue. You don't need to pelletize it, right? You just put it right into the boilers. and then you actually create power, generate power, you capture the CO2, and then what you need to do then is tap into a CO2 pipeline, and the CO2 gets, and there are lots of CO2 pipelines in Louisiana already. So if you think about it from an economic but also a carbon perspective, that could be a pretty. It's an interesting thing that we're exploring now, as something we might do.
Fascinating. Okay, we've got a question from Juho Liponen from the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, asking about incentivizing carbon capture. So what would be your preferred incentive mechanism to provide the necessary support to actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere?
No, good question. So I'll take this from a UK perspective, because this is where we're working on it first. And there are, again, sort of several, I think, quite effective and proven methods or mechanisms that have worked for other types of renewables. So effectively, when you generate power using BECCS and the negative emissions, the process gives you two sort of commodities effectively. One is the power, and the other is the negative emissions. So in the same way that biomass is, we get a biomass sort of incentive regime today, or the way that offshore wind has worked, for example, we think the first project should be one where the government gives, effectively provides a contract for difference, so a price for the power and a price for the negative emissions. They will both be sort of relative to a reference price. So, for example, if you gave me £50 per megawatt hour for the power, and then we would sell the power into the wholesale market, and then effectively the government would make up the difference depending on where it was. And you do the same for the negative emissions, right? So, and everyone's got their own view of where carbon prices might be or where they should be, but just by way of example, so the recent Morgan Stanley report I saw had sort of a base case for the EU ETS being at about call it plus or minus 100 euros a ton by 2030. At that kind of level, if I got a contract from the UK government for that level for, let's say, a 10 or 15-year period, then we could make this work, right? And I think in the first instance, that's a contract we would need to be a first of a kind project, and we would need some revenue certainty to make the investments that are needed. I mean, this is a £1 billion plus kind of project. But the interesting thing for me is if carbon prices continue to rise, which I think that they will, and if we're going to get to net zero, I think that's critical. Then this actually has got a really interesting potential to be very economic and ultimately be freestanding on its own. Right? As long as you can get, I guess the fundamental point is we need to be able to get a credit for the CO2 we capture that's equivalent to the tax that other people might pay.
Got it. Got it. Since we're talking about carbon price, and since you've raised the question about what could happen in America, we've got a good question coming from Anne Canavati, and she asks, what are some of the lessons learned from your experience in the UK that could be applied to the US to see more carbon capture? Do you think that the lack of a national carbon target is a showstopper for wide-scale CCS deployment?
That's a very good question. I mean, the interesting thing about this is that in some ways the U.S. is ahead of the U.K. on carbon capture. To be honest, right? I mean, what's happening now is some of the good things that I think are happening in the way the U.K. process is evolving. Is you have concerted government efforts to work with industry to put sort of clusters of industrial infrastructure in place, right? So where this is obviously very geographically specific, and the infrastructure is a big part of the cost. So getting government, private sector partnership to work on putting infrastructure in place, I think, is a very critical piece of it. Right? Then the second piece of it, I think, which is in progress, but I think it should and I believe will work, is actually the regulatory framework. How do you actually establish a regulatory framework? And the UK has, it's obviously a significantly smaller country, but it's one regulatory entity, so they can do that in a way that actually works, relative. I mean, frankly, I think the U.S. utility markets are probably not at this similar size. In fact, probably bigger in many cases than the UK. But the interesting thing about the U.S. is, and I'm not so close to this at this point, is that at least conceptually, if you take 45Q plus California low carbon fuel standard, et cetera, I think that there's interesting ways that we could potentially apply those things to BECCS, and that's one of the things that we'll start working on, which is how do we actually try to make enable those standards to work with BECCS, and I think that would be a really interesting opportunity.
Really interesting. Okay, Philippe Vedran has asked a bunch of questions, and I've gotten to most of them through other means, but I do want to get to one that he's asked, which is if Drax will be exempted of the CO2 ETS quota on your emissions. You have any sense
So let me see if I can answer this. So when we generate, I'll give you our portfolio. So we've got today we still got some coal, some gas, some biomass. So when we generate with coal, we pay we have to pay the EU ETS in the
Yeah.
current world. Similarly on gas, on biomass we do not. Right. So biomass does not attract the EU ETS. Right. But the key is that right now the EU is debating this topic. What happens when you get carbon removal technologies, right? You know, what I think would make a lot of sense is if I generate a ton of carbon removal, I should be not given, I should earn one of those ETSs, right? And
Mhm.
I think there's a really interesting play there, both from it makes logical, but also from the point of view of sort of improving the market dynamics, right? If you have both users of credits and creators of credits, you've got better supply and demand dynamics, right?
Yep.
And I think something that could be really could be quite interesting. Now, you asked me what happens in the UK, and the UK is all up in the air. We should be leaving the EU in about 7 weeks, and I think we're going to hear on December 12th how the UK equivalent of either an ETS type system or a tax will work. So.
Got it. Okay, I want to pivot the questions just a little bit because we've been talking about CO2, but I'm wondering if there are other environmental benefits from switching from coal to pellets. What about air quality? What about the other emissions, et cetera? Like what do you see change when you switched from coal to primarily biomass?
So the effectively the chemistry makeup means the emissions levels of NOx and SOx are very low. So that is a very direct benefit of biomass. I mean, so we put in place FGD for our coal, which we don't need to use with the biomass, right? So desulfurization is not required, which is very good from both an environmental and a cost perspective. So that's a significant positive. Um, and actually, when you add the CCS, it's quite interesting because actually to get the level of absorption of the CO2 to separate the CO2 out from the rest of the flue gas, you need a very clean stream of flue gas, right? So actually, as we put that in place, we will be significantly reducing, any other. I mean, particulates is the one area very specifically. And our particulate emissions are already quite low, but with the CCS, we will reduce them further. And so actually, once we have the CCS infrastructure on top of the biomass, the flue gas that would go out, the depleted flue gas would be quite clean. Yeah.
Okay, so when you move from coal to biomass, or you're still using some coal, but coal to biomass, your particulate has gone down already, but you see that dropping even more with the carbon capture. That's 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 another real positive. I take of the
No, yeah.
technology.
That's why we like the term negative emissions. Yeah.
Yep, yep, exactly. We had a question about the carbon dioxide, the CO2, and where it will be stored under the North Sea. This comes from Robert Giffen. Because there are a bunch, several projects. Who are you working with on that?
So we're working with something that was actually sort of announced, I think last week. That's now called the Northern Endurance Partnership. So effectively, there's the two of the industrial clusters in the UK, in England, that are working on this. One is in Humberside, which is where we are, which is about three-quarters of the way up the east coast of England. And then there's Teesside, which is it's the next river north of where we are, another industrial area. And so effectively, both of us are relatively well situated to access this saline aquifer that's called Endurance, which is about 60 kilometers off the coast. So this Northern Endurance Partnership, which includes BP, Equinor, Total, a bunch of, frankly, yeah, I think mostly, if not completely, oil and gas companies with lots of North Sea offshore experience. They will be managing the offshore storage piece, and effectively, this is part of I think the interesting part that needs to be worked out is actually how does that ultimately get managed from a sort of infrastructure perspective, from a priorities perspective, from a build out, because there's a real opportunity for the government in the UK to say, look, we'll start with, let's say, that Northern Endurance Partnership, and we'll start with that one aquifer. But then as the system grows, if you have a sort of hub and spoke opportunity to sort of start from there and then access, there's lots of offshore storage in the North Sea. Right? So.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, one final question from Rachel Smolker, and she's asking about your carbon capture pilot project, and intended to capture 1 ton of CO2 per day. How much CO2 have you succeeded in capturing, and what happens to that CO2? Where does that go?
So I'll talk more broadly about that. So I mean, the simple answer to the last part of the question is we haven't been storing it. We've actually been releasing it back to atmosphere. So although that's not a completely the answer, because some of it, what we've created is actually a carbon engineering research park, effectively at Drax, right, where we've got some partners who are looking at using it for other things, right? So, for example, we have a company who's looking at using, biogenic CO2 for making animal feed, right? So there's some sort of test projects happening there. And so we've got two different pilots. One is with a company called Sea Capture, capturing a ton a day, and they are sort of called a next generation solvent, which we think is very interesting because it's organic and therefore ultimately over time lower cost. It has attractive sort of dynamic properties, which means we think it will take less energy. And we're also working with MHI and Shell on a couple, and there's two other partners we're working with on different pilots.
Got it. Well, we are out of time. So this was really great. I think we could have kept going for another half hour. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. And thank you, Will, for this really great presentation. Looking forward to following this as it continues to develop. I hope that you will join us for the next episode of Innovation Stream next Friday, November 13th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, which will feature Dr. Emily Reichert, the Chief Executive Officer of Greentown Labs. And then we have a number of other events coming up this month. On November 10th at 9 a.m., we'll host an event to help launch the US-Europe Energy Bridge, which is the next evolution of USAID's energy sector assistance in Europe and Eurasia. And then on November 16th, we will host an Atlantic Council front page event with ENI CEO Claudio Descalzi to roll out their new strategy for the energy transition. Former Secretary Ernie Moniz has also agreed to join that discussion. So that's going to be very interesting. You can find out more about both of these events and others at the Atlantic Council website. Thank you to everyone who helped put this event together, including Veda Kruma, Roger Morales, Emma Smith, and Olga Kokova. This presentation will be available on the Atlantic Council website, YouTube channel, Facebook, Twitter, etc. So please do share it with your colleagues. Will, thank you again. This was really, really great. I hope to have you back on here in a year or so where we can learn how the project is developing.
No, thank you, Randy. I appreciate it and enjoyed being here.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.